For our second video in this section, we're going to focus on the transfer of energy and matter. And this is for C4.2, and we'll split this into two different parts. So this is for part 1, focusing on energy transfers. We previously defined populations and communities, in which communities are lots of different populations of species living in the same area, and ecosystems is the next level or the next layer to that, and it's composed of all of the organisms, all of the communities in a particular area that also includes the abiotic environmental factors, because organisms are dependent on one another as well as the abiotic surroundings to be able to survive. And so this would include components of the air, the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, oxygen, water, soil, rock material. All of those aspects, as well as more, dictate or influence the survival of organisms. And a system in biology is a set of interactions or interdependent components, and ecosystems as systems can be open or closed. Open system, the resources then can enter and exit, both chemicals and substances, chemical substances and energy. A closed system, then energy cannot enter or exit. Chemical resources can be removed or replaced. And for the most part, ecosystems are open systems, as resources can enter or exit. For most ecosystems, sunlight is the primary source of energy, and that's used by photosynthesis to be able to produce energy for that ecosystem. Producers perform photosynthesis, as we previously talked about. Cyanobacteria, plants, eukaryotic algae, including seaweeds, they all do photosynthesis, and that energy produced by these organisms then is available to others that cannot photosynthesize, other organisms. Ecosystems vary in the amount of energy available as different parts of the world receive different amounts of sunlight, as well as other abiotic conditions that would influence rates of photosynthesis. And so that really changes the amount of energy that's available in different parts of the world. For example, the Sahara Desert has lots of sunlight, very, very warm temperatures, but there's not a lot of producers because it's very limited water. And so that restricts the amount of energy available. The redwood forests in California, different type of ecosystem in which there's less sunlight than what we would find in the Sahara, but there's a lot more producers and energy available due to other favorable environmental conditions, being lots of water as well. Aquatic systems are different than terrestrial in that light penetrates water, but it doesn't completely transmit water. Shorter wavelengths penetrate further or deeper in the water, which is why we often see the ocean, the sea be blue. And within marine aquatic systems, the open ocean has light transmission that's better than inland or close to shore because there's typically less sediment and less turbidity. The water's less cloudy, and so light can penetrate that easier compared to the coastal waters. Light can penetrate about 200 meters deep, about 600 feet. And so then coastal water is more turbid due to clay or silt and dense phytoplankton that's in the water. And so there's less light that's transmitted. Deep ocean, like really deep ocean, must rely on other sources of energy besides sunlight because that light can't penetrate past those 200 meters. It is possible for ecosystems to be closed or restricted, much less common. An example would be in a dark cave in which streams would provide dead organic matter that supplies energy. So this would not be an entirely closed system, but no sunlight. That are organic materials, then providing the energy that's needed to be able to produce or host life. And sealed caves, where things are not able to come in or out, energy can be provided by archaea bacteria. They gain energy from use of methane or sulfides or other inorganic compounds through chemiosynthesis. Macro or microscopic invertebrates feed on that the archaea. Within other invertebrates feeding on them. And a good example is actually in the country of Romania along the Black Sea. There's a cave there that exhibits these closed systems, and some very interesting organisms, crazy looking organisms can be found in the caves. So it represents a very different ecosystem because it's a closed with energy not able to enter or to leave. Within ecosystems, energy moves throughout from one organism to the next, and we refer to this as a food chain, which is a linear sequence of organisms in which the organisms feed on the previous. It's a straight line where we can see the transfer of energy from one organism to another. It's generally between 2 to 5 organisms in length. with the first being a producer, something that photosynthesizes, and all of those thereafter being consumers because they are consuming something. The food chain shows then the transfer of energy from producer to increasing consumer levels with first, second, third, sometimes even fourth consumer levels. No consumer feeds on that last organism in a food chain. That represents the apex predator because nothing kills it or eats them, though sometimes parasites can still obtain energy from them, like mosquitoes, for example. And we use then arrows from one organism to next to show the direction of the energy flow from that producer to the consumer, and so on. However, ecosystems are not linear, and they're not defined by just 2 to 5 organisms. There's lots of different organisms that interact with one another in different ways, and so ecosystems are better represented by something called a food web because they contain numerous organisms interacting with one another, and it's really this complex web of interactions. The trophic level of a food web or a food chain is the level that the organism exists within that sequence, that chain, based off of its feeding relationships. And so many consumers obtain energy by feeding on more than one species, and a food web is a model that then summarizes all of these interactions and is essentially multiple food chains combined that show the whole community. It does show multiple organisms at the same trophic level, but organisms can sometimes occupy multiple trophic levels depending on what they're eating, because organisms will typically eat multiple different things. And it's a better representation of the overall ecosystem and community in terms of trophic levels because for exactly that reason, organisms are not just eating one thing. They obtain energy in multiple different ways, as we can see in our images demonstrated here. An essential component of an ecosystem and a community is a decomposer, and these are organisms that consume dead or waste organic material in order to be able to obtain energy. Examples of material that would be consumed would be dead organisms, body parts shed by plants like fallen leaves or animals, exoskeletons, undigested waste, feces. All of these would be things that decomposers would consume. And they are essential because without decomposers, all of this waste would not be recycled. They're essential to be able to recycle the waste and return energy back into the ecosystem, as other organisms will come along and consume the decomposer itself. And so there's 2 types. Detritivores are those that consume dead waste, organic matter, sometimes referred to as detritus, in order to obtain energy. These are often invertebrate insects, can include mites, beetles, butterflies, flies. Mollusks would also represent examples, earthworms, millipedes, woodlice. Those are all examples of detrivores. Saprotrophs are a second class or group of decomposers, but these secrete digestive enzymes into the organic matter for external digestion and then absorption of the amino acids and the sugars that have been broken down through digestion. Fungi are good examples of these. And bacteria can also do this. Those are the 2 main types, and they are capable of breaking down the insoluble carbon compounds into more simple compounds. A tree, for example, like you probably, if you've gone for a hike or been in the forest, seen a fallen tree, oftentimes there's mushrooms growing on it, and those are saprotrophs that are obtaining energy by external digestion. There's 2 main groups or categories within ecosystems and within food webs, and the first we refer to as autotrophs, and these are organisms that can make all the necessary carbon compounds themselves using carbon dioxide, hydrogen carbonates, as well as nitrate, phosphate, and other simple organic substances. Essentially, these are the organisms that can make their own energy. They require some sort of external energy source to do this. Usually it's the sun, sometimes it's also chemical, and they produce energy for themselves to be able to make these carbon compounds by carbon fixation. They take inorganic forms of carbon and convert it into organic compounds. It's essential that the autotrophs fix carbon or change its form, as it's the source of organic material and energy for all other organisms, because other organisms will come along and eat those autotrophs. And autotrophs use energy to be able to then synthesize the compounds, organic compounds that they need from these by using the energy that they obtained from the sun or from some chemical source. So as autotrophs need some sort of external energy source to be able to make these more complex carbon compounds, through the process of condensation reactions. Most of that external energy is coming from sunlight, and we refer to these types of organisms as photoautotrophs. They're using light photo to be able to make their complex carbon compounds. Plants, algae, cyanobacteria, as we've discussed, are examples that use sunlight to be able to photosynthesize. The chemical organisms that are able to do this, that use chemicals, are referred to as chemoautotrophs, and they use exothermic inorganic chemical reactions, archaea. Some bacteria are able to do this. Substrate in a reduced state, sulfur, hydrogen sulfide, iron ammonia, all of those different compounds, depending on the organism type, those reduced state compounds can be oxidized to release energy that then can be used to synthesize carbon compounds. And so in some of our previous videos, we've talked about archaea that live in deep sea vents and are able to survive off of sulfur. This would be an example of a chemoautotroph. Other bacteria are also able to oxidize iron. And in this process, iron sulfide is found in sedimentary rocks that are formed in low oxygen environments. When they're exposed to air, usually through mining activities, the iron sulfide reacts to produce iron ions and sulfate ions and sulfuric acid. The iron oxidizing bacteria remove electrons from the iron ions, converting from iron 2 to iron 3. Electrons then carry the energy released by oxidation of iron and are used to then reduce NAD. Other electrons are used for proton pumping to create a proton gradient across the plasma membrane, allowing for the production of ATP by chemiosmosis. And so, although where this initial source of energy is different for these organisms, they're still producing reduced NAD and producing ATP. As we saw in photosynthesis, both of those are used to be able to produce the sugar, the carbon compounds, through the process of photosynthesis. So it's very similar, just that initial source of energy is different than what we would see with photosynthetic organisms. Heterotrophs then, on the other hand, obtain nutritional requirements. They obtain energy by consuming other organisms, by ingesting carbon from an organism in order to be able to build more complex carbon compounds that they need. And the process includes a couple of different steps, the first being digestion, in which is the breakdown of those carbon compounds. Assimilation is the process of absorbing those carbon compounds and making them part of the body of the heterotroph itself. This requires absorption, so the molecules must be small enough to be able to be absorbed by the cell. So larger molecules, proteins, polysaccharides, nucleic acids, have to go through that digestion step first. And then the last step is synthesis. So after the digestion and assimilation, the products, that energy can be used to build complex compounds needed by the heterotroph. So it's essentially taking the energy and breaking it down into individual components, to monomers, to be able to build up polysaccharides, the larger molecules, in order polymers to be able to create the structures that the heterotroph needs to be able to survive. Both autotrophs and heterotrophs must have energy in the form of ATP in their cells to be able to perform functions. And that ATP is produced by cellular respiration, as we previously have talked about, essentially the take-in of carbon compounds, carbs, or lipids, oxidizing them to release energy, which is used to phosphorylate ADP to make ATP. And then that ATP can be used to perform a wide variety of different actions, synthesizing large molecules like DNA, RNA, proteins, pumping molecules or ions across membranes through active transport, moving structures within cells like vesicles or chromosomes, muscle contraction, maintaining body temperature in birds or mammals, and a variety of other functions are all necessary or require ATP to be able to be used. So in looking at all of the organisms that exist within an ecosystem, in order to divide or to classify, to organize, the organisms are placed into different trophic levels. And these are, again, organisms are classified into these different groups, these different levels, depending on how they obtain energy and carbon compounds. It's essentially their position in the food chains based on their feeding relationships. And as previously mentioned, many organisms have multiple ways of obtaining energy, and so they can occupy multiple different trophic levels. For example, red foxes primarily eat first-level consumers because they're predators, so therefore they would be secondary consumers, but sometimes they will also eat a variety of producers like leaves, roots, tubers, fruits, nuts, so they can also be primary consumers. So just an example where we see some organisms have multiple different trophic levels and consumer levels. And so you should be able to, in looking at a food chain or a food web, identify consumer and trophic levels based off of the flow of energy. We can depict the amount of energy that's available within an ecosystem by producing an energy pyramid, and this pyramid shape is used to be able to show the amount of energy gained or available at each of the different trophic levels. The amount of energy are measured per unit area and per year, so it's often measured in units of kilojoules per meter squared per year, and it's a more accurate way of producing this is in a stepped shape rather than a triangular traditional pyramid, with producers on the lowest bar and then the different consumer levels or following that. Bars are labeled with producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and so on, depending on if there are more. And if a scale is used, then the bar lengths, how long they are, should be proportional to the amount of energy shown. And so for a little bit of practice, after looking at these examples here for energy pyramids, draw an energy pyramid for an ecosystem that has the following values: 100,000 kilojoules per year per square meter for producers, 2,000 for primary consumers, 100 for secondary consumers, and 15,000 for decomposers. So here's hopefully what your pyramid looks like. You should be comfortable using or taking some data to be able to produce a pyramid like what we've done here. This transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next is never 100% efficient. It's actually not very efficient at all. And so that results in less and less energy being available at each successive level due to three primary causes. One is incomplete consumption. Organisms usually are not entirely consumed. Only parts of the plant or animal are consumed. For example, bones in animals typically are not consumed. And so that leaves energy left over that passes then to saprotrophs rather than on to the next trophic level. And so it essentially removes that energy from the food chain. Additionally, incomplete digestion. Not all the parts of the organism are digested. For example, plants have tough fiber in them that is not able to be digested and is rather excreted as feces. And so similar to the unconsumed material, this energy then is removed from the food chain and passes on to the decomposers. Cell respiration is the third, and in carbon compounds being oxidized through this process to produce energy, there are some waste products of carbon dioxide and water, and that carbon dioxide and water do not provide energy for the next trophic level, so that's also representing waste. And so although variation exists from one food chain to the next, approximately about 90% of energy is lost between the transfer from one trophic level to the next, with only about 10% being transferred. So that's not very efficient at all. And this is one of the main reasons why less biomass is found at successive trophic levels, because there's less and less energy available. As energy enters ecosystems, for the most part, usually through sunlight, it's then converted from one form to another. Photosynthesis being the start of that process to convert it into chemical energy that then flows through the food chains. Eventually, all of that energy is transformed into heat. Autotrophs and heterotrophs convert some of the chemical energy into heat. This is especially so in organisms that maintain their body temperature, like birds and mammals. And heat is also generated during the process of cell respiration. The second law of thermodynamics states that energy transformations are not 100% efficient. Therefore, not all of the energy from oxidation of carbon compounds, sugars, is transferred directly into ATP, and so then the remainder is lost as heat. Another good example in humans or other animals, muscles warm up when they contract, and so a lot of that energy in the transfer from one trophic level to the next is lost in the form of heat. Because that lost heat energy cannot be converted back into chemical energy that's used by other trophic levels, it's lost from that food chain, and that then creates less energy available for each successive trophic level. Carbon compounds from one level to the next do not contain less energy per gram. It just, there's less available, which results in a limit to the number of trophic levels and biomass at each level. And so this is why we don't see continual food chains or numbers of trophic levels. The higher trophic levels do not have to necessarily eat more. The prey contains large amounts of energy. There's just less numbers of prey because there's less and less energy available because it's been lost to all of those reasons we previously discussed. And so this concludes our discussion of energy. In the second part of this video, we'll look at the transfer of matter with a particular focus on carbon specifically.